I was 34 when cancer took my husband in less than 7 months. That same year, Jessica turned 5. I still remember how her tiny hand wrapped around mine as we walked out of the funeral home. I wasn't thinking about grief then. I was thinking about how to pay rent, how to pack her lunch for school, how to get through the next week without falling apart. Grief, I decided, could wait. I found night shifts at the county hospital. Yelling patients, buzzing monitors, and bed sheets soaked in pain became the background of my life. Every morning I'd come home, take off my scrubs, and quietly slide into bed beside Jessica, who would always scoot over and whisper, "Mommy's home." Sometimes I'd cry silently, careful not to wake her. But other times, I'd just watch her sleep and feel like I was still anchored to the world. I never dated again. Not because I didn't miss companionship, I did, but because I couldn't imagine splitting my already limited energy between my daughter and someone new. The one time a kind pharmacist named Leonard asked me out, I turned him down with a polite lie. "I'm just not ready," I'd said. What I meant was, I'm already in love, with the idea of giving my daughter everything I never had. We had traditions, Jessica and I. Every Friday night, we made grilled cheese sandwiches and watched old VHS tapes I recorded years ago. Saturdays, we made pancakes with chocolate chips shaped like smiley faces. And every night before bed, we wrote one sentence each in a shared notebook. Hers were usually things like, "Today I jumped over the biggest puddle." And mine, "Today I watched my daughter become a little more herself." That notebook still sits on my shelf. When she was 9, she wrote, "If I ever get married, I want my husband to live with us, not the other way around." I laughed and kissed her forehead. "He better like grilled cheese," I said. I remember winters when the heater gave out and we curled under layers of blankets, inventing silly songs to stay warm. Summers, we'd go to the public pool, and I'd sit in the shallow end with my work-tired legs soaking in the water, watching her cannonball into laughter. She used to call me her magic mom, because I could sew a ripped teddy bear back together in 5 minutes flat. There were hard days, of course. Days when I yelled too loud or cried too long, when the bills piled up and my body ached and I felt like the world had left me behind. But Jessica always brought me back. A sticky note in my lunchbox, a hug out of nowhere, a drawing of me in a superhero cape taped to the fridge. She was my reason, my rhythm, my world. When she turned 18 and got into college, I clapped the loudest in the auditorium. She wore a navy blue cap and held her diploma like it was made of gold. That night, over cake and cheap champagne, she said, "No matter where I go, I'll always come back to you. You're home, Mom." Home. That word carried me through every moment she was away. I'd keep her room tidy just in case she decided to visit on a whim. I'd text her twice a week, never more, not wanting to hover, as she once gently put it. Sometimes she replied, sometimes she didn't. I figured it was just growing pains. When she met Mark, she sent me a picture first. Him, smiling wide, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them wearing matching hiking boots. "He's thoughtful and grounded," she'd said. "You'll like him." I told her I already did. They came to visit 3 months later. I made lasagna, her favorite. We laughed, reminisced, and drank too much red wine. When they left, she hugged me for a second longer than usual. "I told him," she whispered. "If we ever get married, we'll find a way to live with you. I want you there, always." I smiled and nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, because I believed her. Jessica and Mark got married the following spring in a modest outdoor ceremony. The sun shone just right that day, and Jessica looked radiant, her eyes glowing with certainty. She asked me to sit in the front row and be the one to hand her the bouquet before she walked down the aisle. "You're not just my mother, you're my foundation," she'd said. I believed her. After the honeymoon, Jessica called one evening, excitement crackling in her voice. "We've talked it over," she said. "Mark and I want you to live with us. It's silly for you to be alone in that big old house." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to be close to her, but because that big old house was filled with my memories, my battles, and the man I'd once loved. Still, I agreed. If being with her meant letting go of those rooms, I would. They came by the next week to help me pack. I noticed Mark was efficient, bordering on impatient, tossing items into boxes, labeling things old kitchen, mom stuff. He didn't ask if I wanted to keep the chipped mug Dan had always used or the curtain I sewed by hand when Jessica was a baby. I let it go. Maybe he was just nervous about the move. Their home was modern and clean, with sharp edges and minimalist furniture. No framed pictures of childhood, no mismatched cushions, just chrome and silence. They gave me the guest room, small but comfortable, with a narrow window that let in slivers of light around 4 p.m. each day. I put up a picture of Jessica when she was 10, smiling with a missing tooth, holding a kitten we never kept. The first few weeks were calm. We shared dinners, played board games on Fridays, and even cooked together once or twice. Jessica still kissed my cheek every morning, and Mark would thank me for helping with laundry. It felt almost natural. But slowly, things shifted. It began with little things. The hallway closet was suddenly locked. The dishes had a new arrangement that only they seemed to know. Jessica suggested I knock before entering their bedroom, which I already did, but now it sounded more like a rule than a request. When I made soup one evening, Mark tasted it, smiled politely, and added salt without saying a word. Later, I overheard him tell Jessica, "She means well, but this isn't her house." That phrase sat in my chest like a stone. One afternoon, while looking for extra light bulbs in the garage, I found a manila folder marked Deed Transfer. Curiosity got the better of me. Inside were documents prepared to shift ownership of my old house, my house, to Jessica. I blinked. It was already in my name, left to me by Dan. There was no reason for this transfer, unless it had already happened. Mark walked in just as I was holding the folder. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, not guilt. Control. "You found the papers," he said evenly. "We were going to talk to you about that. It's just easier for tax purposes if everything's under Jessica's name now." Easier. A word that sliced through me like a whisper in a church. I said nothing. I placed the folder back where I found it, smiled weakly, and walked out. That night, I barely slept. My bed felt unfamiliar. The house creaked differently. Even Jessica's laughter downstairs sounded distant. I started to notice more things after that. Jessica consulted Mark before every decision, even the smallest ones. Should Mom use the guest bathroom or ours today? Is it okay if she reorganizes the spice rack? It was like I had become a tenant in their life. Polite, tolerated, but unnecessary. The notebook we used to write in? Still on my nightstand, but I hadn't touched it in months. The last entry, in Jessica's handwriting, read, "We'll make new memories here." I wondered who the "we" was. One evening, as we finished dinner, I asked gently if they'd thought about visiting the old neighborhood, maybe stop by the community center, see some familiar faces. Jessica smiled, but Mark replied, "We're trying to build forward, not backward." I nodded, and in that moment I realized I was backward. I was the past they were politely pushing away, and though I had once been her home, now I was just a guest they hadn't yet asked to leave. Mark had always known how to say the right thing. In the early days, he called me Ma like it was second nature, brought me herbal tea when I had a cough, and even offered to drive me to church on Sundays. At first, I was grateful, impressed even. I told Jessica once, "You picked a good one." She smiled and said, "I learned from the best." But as weeks turned into months, the warmth cooled into politeness, and politeness hardened into boundaries. Mark began to establish unspoken rules, ones Jessica never corrected. At dinner, conversation was steered by him. He led, we followed. Topics that didn't interest him were gently dismissed, like dust brushed off a clean surface. My stories from the hospital, memories of Jessica's childhood, even silly jokes, met with half smiles or redirected eyes. Then came the first real boundary. "Evelyn," he said one morning over coffee, "we've decided it's best that you don't pick up Eli from daycare anymore unless we ask." His tone was calm, but final. I blinked. I only did that once when you were late. He loves riding in the back seat and, yes, but we're trying to maintain consistency, he interrupted. Routine is important for toddlers. Jessica didn't look up from her toast. After that, there were more rules. Don't rearrange the pantry. Mark liked his labels facing forward. Don't use scented detergent. Eli had sensitive skin. Don't sing lullabies at bedtime. It overstimulated him. Each restriction carved away a piece of me, of the role I thought I still played. Slowly, I began to ask before doing anything. Is it okay if I make dinner tonight? Should I vacuum or will it disturb your meetings? Would you prefer I keep Eli out of the living room when you're home? No one told me I was a burden, but every answer made me feel like one. Jessica changed, too. She no longer kissed my cheek in the mornings. The shared laughter became shorter, her texts more mechanical. She didn't sit with me for tea like we used to. When I'd ask if she wanted to join me for a walk or a movie night, she'd say, I have work, or Mark and I already have plans. One afternoon, I came home from the market and found my bedroom door wide open, boxes stacked on the bed. Mark stood in the corner with a measuring tape, inspecting the wall opposite the window. I stared at him, groceries hanging from my arms. What's going on? Oh, he said, barely glancing over. I thought we mentioned it. Jessica and I are expanding the home office. I'll just need part of this room for file storage. I looked around. My dresser had been moved. My rocking chair was gone. The closet was half empty. Where's my sewing machine? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. It's in the basement, he replied, as if that solved everything. That night, Jessica assured me it was temporary. We just need space, she said. Mark's caseload is growing. When I asked if I should move out, she laughed nervously. Don't be silly, Mom. This is your home too. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. The final blow came on a Sunday morning. Jessica was hosting a small brunch for her colleagues. I helped set the table, arranged flowers, and even baked banana bread from scratch, Jessica's childhood favorite. As the guests arrived, I floated in and out of the kitchen, pouring juice, keeping Eli entertained. One of the women complimented the bread. It smells like my grandmother's house, she said. Jessica smiled. Thank my mom. She's the secret weapon around here. Mark chuckled. She's the best live-in help we could ask for. It was meant as a joke, maybe. Everyone laughed, even Jessica. I froze, clutching the juice pitcher, and turned toward Eli, who was sitting in his high chair, babbling. One of the guests leaned down and asked him, Who's that? Eli looked up at me, beamed, and said, That's the helper lady. My chest tightened. Jessica's smile faded. I excused myself and went upstairs, my hands shaking as I placed the pitcher on the bathroom counter. In the mirror, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, tired eyes, bent shoulders, and lips pressed together to keep from trembling. I wasn't their mother. I wasn't their guest. I wasn't even family. I had become furniture, useful, quiet, and in the way. That night, I went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed. I looked at the empty plates, the leftover banana bread, and the smudge of juice Eli had spilled. I thought of that little girl who used to write in our journal every night, who called me her safe place. And I asked myself the question I hadn't dared to voice until now. When did I stop being a blessing and start being a burden? I didn't mean to drop the photo box. It had been tucked away on the top shelf of the hallway closet, one of the few spaces in the house I still felt was mine. I only went up there occasionally, usually when I needed to remember who I used to be. That day, I wanted to find a picture of Jessica and me from her high school graduation, to frame it beside my bed, something soft to hold on to. But my hand slipped. The cardboard tore. Dozens of photos rained to the floor like fragile leaves in a storm. I dropped to my knees, cradling bent edges, smiling faces, memories captured in silence. There was Jessica with braces and wild hair, grinning through a missing tooth. Me, holding her in my lap after her first ballet recital. Dan, her father, holding her on his shoulders the day we bought the house. I was still kneeling, holding a photo of the three of us in front of the porch, when Mark walked by. He didn't offer to help pick them up. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "You really cling to that stuff, don't you?" I looked up, startled. "They're memories," he shrugged. "Living in the past won't change anything now." I held the photo tighter. "They remind me of who we were." Mark smirked. "Maybe that's the problem. You keep holding on to who Jessica was, not who she is." I opened my mouth, then closed it. He turned and walked away without another word. That evening, Jessica came home, and I tried to talk to her, tried to explain how I felt pushed aside, erased. I brought up the box, how Mark had spoken to me, how things were changing faster than I could understand. She listened quietly, too quietly, and when I finished, she leaned against the wall and said, "Maybe it's time we talk about space." I blinked. "What do you mean?" Jessica sighed, avoiding my eyes. "Mark and we feel like the house is getting too crowded. Eli's growing. He'll need his own room soon. Mark's cases are piling up. And you deserve your own space too. Somewhere peaceful, somewhere without noise." "Are you asking me to leave?" I whispered. Jessica didn't answer right away. Then she said, "We'll help you find a nice apartment. We'll cover rent. You won't have to worry about anything. You've done so much already." Her words were kind, but her tone, detached, like she was negotiating with a client, not her mother. My heart thudded against my ribs. "You said this was my home, too." "It was," she said softly, "but things change." I stood there, rooted in the kitchen tiles, while she picked up her phone and started scrolling, as if the conversation was over, as if I'd agreed. That night, I packed, not out of spite, not out of drama, just quiet surrender. My things didn't take up much space anyway. A few clothes, some books, a couple framed photos. The rest, my presents, my sacrifices, my story, had already been erased long before. I opened the storage bench at the foot of my bed where I kept blankets and a few old documents, hoping to find the lease to my old house just in case. What I found instead was a manila folder, inside a real estate transfer agreement. Property. My old house. The one Dan and I bought with our savings. Buyer, Jessica Carter. Witness, Mark Evans. Signature, mine. Only it wasn't mine. I stared at the shaky loop of letters, the unfamiliar slant, a poor imitation of my name, Mark's imitation. I knew because I'd seen him forge Eli's name once as a joke on a birthday card. This wasn't a joke. My breath caught in my throat. The paper crinkled in my fingers. My body shook, not with rage, but with a hollow, bone-deep sadness. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted to own the past, too. The next morning, I placed the folder in a sealed envelope and tucked it into the bottom of my suitcase. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask questions. I'd learned by now that some truths don't deserve confrontation. They deserve distance. As I stood in the doorway with my bags, Jessica hugged me briefly like someone hugging a neighbor moving away. Mark nodded. Eli was napping. No tears, no hesitation, no apology, just the quiet closing of a door behind me. The apartment was smaller than I'd imagined and colder than it had any right to be. It sat above a closed-down thrift store, the kind of place where light filtered through grimy blinds and floors groaned with every step. The walls were stained with stories I didn't want to hear, and the air smelled faintly of dust and forgotten time. But it was mine. The landlord, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers and a voice like gravel, handed me the key without a smile. "Water pressure's fickle," he said, "and don't bother calling if the heater breaks. Just give it a kick." I nodded, not out of acceptance, but resignation. I had no energy left to argue with the world. The apartment came furnished, if you could call it that. A sagging couch that creaked when I sat, a chipped table barely standing on 3 legs, and in the corner, beneath a single overhead bulb, sat a rocking chair, faded blue, the kind grandmothers are buried with in movies. I ran my hand over the armrest. It wobbled. It would have to do. I unpacked slowly, folded my clothes into warped drawers, placed 2 plates in the cupboard, and stuck Jessica's drawing, one she'd made in 2nd grade, on the refrigerator with a magnet that barely held. The sketch showed me with a superhero cape, arms stretched wide, saving a stick figure version of her from a monster labeled Monday. That night, I slept with the sound of pipes hissing and a siren screaming in the distance. I pulled the thin blanket up to my chin and stared at the ceiling until morning arrived. Not because I was awake, but because sleep no longer came when called. 3 weeks later, my birthday arrived. I didn't expect much. But part of me hoped for a text, a voicemail, even a mistakenly sent emoji. By noon, I realized none would come. I walked to the bakery 2 blocks away, a corner shop with cracked windows and flies buzzing near the display case. I asked the clerk for a small chocolate cupcake. 1 candle? He asked. I nodded. No party. I smiled. Just me. Back in the apartment, I placed the cupcake on a chipped plate, stuck the candle in, and lit it. The flame flickered gently, like it wasn't sure it wanted to stay alive either. I sat in the rocking chair and whispered, "Happy birthday, Evelyn." I blew out the candle. No wishes made. No wishes left. I ate the cupcake in silence, the frosting too sweet, the cake too dry. But I chewed slowly, letting the bitterness of the moment settle behind my teeth. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I watched reruns of old sitcoms with the volume low, stared at the phone like it might ring out of guilt. It didn't. By nightfall, I felt like a ghost haunting a life I no longer belonged to. I found myself pacing the tiny apartment, arms crossed tight over my chest, trying to warm myself from the inside out. The heater hadn't worked since I moved in. I tried kicking it like the landlord said, but all it did was groan, louder than before. So I wrapped myself in a coat, sat back in the rocker, and watched the window. Nothing out there but blinking traffic lights and drifting trash. A thought crept in, uninvited but persistent. If I died here, how long would it take before anyone noticed? A day? A week? Would the landlord smell something? Would Jessica even find out? Would she care? I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, dry. Once strong enough to carry Jessica through her worst fevers, now barely strong enough to open jars. I wasn't bitter, not exactly. I didn't wish harm on them. I just wanted to matter, even if just a little, even if just for a moment. I stood, walked to the mirror above the sink, and stared at myself. There I was, still here, still breathing, still invisible. I whispered to the woman in the glass, "You used to be someone." And the woman whispered back, "Maybe you still are." But the voice was thin, unsure. And that night, as I pulled the blanket around me, I made no promises to tomorrow. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because I'd marked the day to mop the bathroom floor. I'd been putting it off for days, annoyed by how the grime clung to the corners. That morning, I'd finally decided enough was enough. So I filled a small bucket, grabbed the sponge, and got to work, kneeling, scrubbing, humming a tune I could barely remember the lyrics to. The tile was slicker than I realized. 1 second, I was leaning forward to rinse the sponge. The next, my foot slid. My shoulder struck the sink. My head hit the wall. Everything went dark. I don't know how long I was there. I remember the cold of the tile against my cheek, the ache pulsing through my temple, and the taste of blood at the corner of my mouth. I couldn't move, not out of pain, but fear that if I tried, nothing would happen. So I lay there, in a puddle of dirty water and regret, wondering if this was how it ended. I must have passed out again because the next thing I saw was a flickering ceiling light and a shadow moving across the hallway. My neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, the widow from apartment 3C, had heard the faucet running for too long and decided to knock. When I didn't answer, she called the super. He opened the door and found me there, curled up like an afterthought on the bathroom floor. They called an ambulance. At the hospital, everything was white. White sheets, white walls, white noise buzzing in my ears. Nurses moved around me like choreographed ghosts. They asked questions I barely understood. Did I have allergies? A heart condition? Next of kin? I mumbled, "No children." It wasn't true, but somehow it felt easier than explaining the truth. That I had a daughter, that she had a husband, that they had a life, that I had once belonged in it, that now I didn't. The nurse didn't blink. She just nodded and moved on. For 2 days, I lay in that bed, bruised and bandaged, staring at the ceiling. No visitors, no calls, no flowers, just the rhythmic beep of the monitor beside me, reminding me that I was still alive, if only barely. On the 3rd morning, a doctor came in with a clipboard and a curious expression. He was young, maybe Jessica's age, with tired eyes and a gentle voice. "Ms. Carter," he said, "we've reviewed your records. You'll be discharged tomorrow if everything checks out." I nodded. "Okay." He hesitated, then held out a file. "There's something you should see." Inside was my medical file, pages of old notes, lab results, emergency contact information, and then a form I didn't recognize. At the top, Advance Directive, Non-Emergent Care Waiver. In the box marked Legal Representative, Mark Evans. Under signature, Mark's familiar scrawl. It stated in clinical language that I had no known immediate family, and that the legal representative assumed responsibility for decisions related to care and cost. It also included a chilling clause. In the event of non-life-threatening incidents, patient shall not be resuscitated without explicit authorization. My hands trembled. He had signed away my right to be saved. The doctor cleared his throat. "We've flagged this for review, but was this arrangement something you were aware of?" I stared at the page, feeling something inside me crack open. "Yes," I lied. "I asked him to do it." He looked surprised. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly. "You're free to revoke it at any time." "I know," I said, folding the file shut. He left me alone with my heartbeat and the echo of everything I'd given up. That night, I sat up in bed and looked out the window. The city lights blinked like Morse code, signals I couldn't decipher. I thought about Jessica, about Mark, about Eli, about how easily people can erase you, not by cruelty, but by silence, not by hate, but by indifference. They had taken my house, my place, my voice. Now they had tried to take my right to be saved. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I felt something else. Clear, cold, steady. They might have signed a paper, but I was the one who still breathed. And I wasn't finished yet. The hospital discharged me with a bottle of painkillers and a list of follow-up appointments I had no intention of keeping. The bruises faded slower than I expected, each one a reminder that my body, like my place in the world, was no longer sturdy. But I walked out of that sterile building with something I hadn't carried in a long time, a sliver of clarity. I didn't go back to the apartment right away. Instead, I followed a social worker's referral to a short-term rehabilitation center tucked in the quieter end of the city. It smelled like old furniture and overbrewed coffee, but the staff smiled with their eyes and the sheets were clean. I told myself it was temporary, just long enough to get my footing back. I didn't want to fall again, not literally and not figuratively either. My roommate was a spry 82-year-old woman named Lucille, who knitted scarves faster than most people could finish a sandwich. She wore bright red lipstick and called everyone darlin', including the nurses who tried to enforce lights out at 9 RPM. On my 3rd night, as I was brushing my hair at the sink, Lucille peeked over her glasses and said, "You got patient fingers." I turned, puzzled. "Patient?" She nodded. "Not everyone handles a comb like that. Smooth, deliberate. You ever sew?" I laughed softly. "Used to? A long time ago." "Well," she said, placing her knitting needles aside, "there's a class here. Bunch of us older girls meet twice a week in the activity room. We try to keep the old skills alive. Buttons, hems, little embroidery tricks. The woman who led it passed away last month. God rest her hands. Been quiet since. You should stop by." I shook my head. "I'm no teacher." Lucille smiled. Neither was she. But she knew how to thread a story into a stitch. That's all we need. I didn't go right away. I told myself I was still healing, that my back hurt, that I had no thread, no needle, no voice left to share. But the truth was, I was afraid that even among those who had known loss, I might still feel invisible. A week passed, then 2. One rainy afternoon, Lucille left a basket at the foot of my bed, a tangled mess of fabrics, needles poking out at odd angles, spools of thread like little rainbows. No note, just a silent invitation. I carried the basket to the activity room. Inside, 6 women sat in a circle, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers leaning nearby. The room smelled like peppermint and lemon oil. They looked up as I entered, and one of them, a round-faced woman with silver curls, said, "New blood?" Lucille raised an eyebrow at me from the far corner. "Told you she'd come." I sat. They didn't ask questions, just handed me a square of linen and nodded toward the hoop in the center of the table. My fingers hesitated, then remembered. The muscle memory returned like a ghost. Loop, pull, twist, secure. We stitched in silence, our needles singing in soft, synchronized motion. At the end of the session, I'd mended a torn napkin and added a tiny rose to the corner. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Someone clapped softly. "You've got a touch," said the silver-haired woman. "Come back Thursday?" I did. 2 sessions later, I was the one explaining back stitches to a woman who'd never sewn before. A week after that, I led the warm-up exercises, showing them how to loosen their fingers. And a few days later, I found myself humming while I stitched, a lullaby I used to sing to Jessica. Then Annie showed up. She was 6, maybe 7, with freckles and a crooked ponytail. Her grandmother, one of the newer residents, brought her along on visiting day and asked if she could sit in. "She gets bored easily," the woman said, apologetic. "You don't have to entertain her." But Annie was curious. She sat beside me, watched closely as I fixed a ripped sleeve, and whispered, "Can I try?" I gave her the smallest needle and the thickest thread. She poked her finger twice, frowned once, then grinned when she made her first stitch. "You're a good teacher," she said. "Are you somebody's grandma?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Before I could answer, she added, "I'm going to call you Grandma Stitch. Is that okay?" I laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. "Okay," I said, "but only if you promise not to poke yourself again." That afternoon, Annie ran down the hallway with her sleeve flapping open, yelling, "Grandma Stitch fixed my shirt." Lucille winked. "Looks like you've got a title now." That night, I sat by the window with a warm cup of tea and stared out at the garden below. The roses were in bloom, their petals bold against the gray sky. I thought about Annie, about Lucille, about the women in the circle, about the tiny rose embroidered on the napkin still folded in my drawer. And I thought, maybe I didn't need to be remembered by the ones who left. Maybe it was enough to be important to those who stayed, even if they'd only just arrived. Word spreads faster than people think, even among the quiet halls of a rehabilitation center. By the end of the month, the sewing circle had outgrown the activity room. Lucille joked that we needed a stadium, or a chapel, she added with a wink. That idea settled in my chest like a seed. The small church down the road, St. Anne's, had a community room that often sat empty during the week. I approached the caretaker, an old man with kind eyes and keys that jingled like sleigh bells. He said yes without hesitation. "It's good to see someone build instead of bury," he told me. So every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I walked to St. Anne's with my basket of supplies and unlocked the door to a growing circle of eager hands and hungry hearts. We stitched everything: tote bags, aprons, memory quilts. Some of the women came with grief stitched into their bones. Others with laughter they hadn't used in years. We patched holes in fabric and in ourselves, one loop at a time. Then came the reporter. She showed up on a windy Tuesday, notebook in hand, scarf flapping like a flag. "I heard about your class from one of the church volunteers," she said. "Would you mind if I sat in?" I shrugged. "As long as you don't mind crooked seams." She smiled and stayed for the whole session, scribbling notes as Annie, my star pupil, showed off her newly embroidered pillowcase. At the end, the reporter pulled me aside and asked if she could take my picture. I hesitated. "Why?" "Because people need to hear this," she said, "that even after life knocks you down, there's still beauty in the making." The article came out 2 weeks later in the Springfield Voice, a local magazine most people skimmed while waiting for their coffee. But this issue was different. There I was, on the cover, holding a bundle of fabric, mid-laugh. The headline read, "Grandma Stitch and the Threads of Healing." It made me chuckle. Lucille clipped a copy and taped it to the church bulletin board. Annie asked for one to bring to school. Even the postman brought it up. "Didn't know you were famous," he said. I didn't feel famous. I just felt seen. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, a young woman I didn't recognize joined the class. She had short hair, nervous eyes, and a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Is this the sewing group?" she asked. I nodded. "You're in the right place." She didn't speak much during the session, but she worked carefully, her fingers precise, like someone who had once known how to sew but hadn't in a long time. At the end, she approached me as I was packing up. "I read about you," she said, her voice soft. "My grandmother used to sew. She passed last year." I touched her arm. "I'm sorry." She opened her bag and pulled out a folded cloth, yellowed with age. "I found this in her attic. She never told me where it came from, but when I saw your face in the article, I thought maybe you'd recognize it." She handed it to me. It was a handkerchief, small, delicate, trimmed in faded pink thread. In the corner, a tiny name was stitched in blue. Jessica. My breath caught. I ran my fingers over the fabric, memories tumbling back like an old film reel. I had made this when Jessica was 6, after she lost her first tooth and cried for 3 days. I told her brave girls carried handkerchiefs instead of tears. She kept it in her backpack for years, until one day it was gone. She said she'd lost it at school. I never saw it again, until now. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. The girl stepped back, alarmed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "No," I said quickly, voice breaking. "No, it's okay." I sat down on the nearest chair and pressed the fabric to my heart. For the first time in a long, long while, I cried. Not out of sadness, not from loneliness or anger or loss. These tears were something else. They were relief. They were proof that once I had mattered, that something I'd made, something I'd poured love into, had survived the forgetting, had traveled through time and hands and memories and somehow made its way back to me. I looked up at the young woman. "Thank you," I whispered. "You have no idea what this means." She smiled gently. "I think I do." Later that night, back in my apartment, I unfolded the handkerchief again. I lit a small candle, placed the cloth beside it, and just sat in silence. For once, the room didn't feel empty, because I was full. And for the first time in years, I wasn't stitching to fill a void. I was stitching to honor the thread that had never really broken. It's strange how small things can spark something much bigger. A photo, a story, a name and a headline. After the article in Springfield Voice came out, I thought it would fade quietly like most local features do. Read once, then recycled with the morning coffee grounds. But somehow, someone reposted it online. Then someone else shared it. Then another. Within days, the story spread far beyond Springfield. I wasn't on social media. I never learned how, but Lucille's granddaughter showed me the comments one afternoon on her tablet. This woman reminds me of my grandma. I miss her every day. Proof that it's never too late to rebuild yourself. Crying at work reading about Grandma Stitch. The nickname stuck. It made me laugh at first, then blush, then eventually accept. If I had to be stitched into the world with a new title, Grandma Stitch wasn't the worst one to wear. A few weeks later, I got a letter. Real mail, stamped and everything. It was an invitation from the Springfield Community Arts Council. They were hosting a local heritage conference, celebrating crafts that had survived the tides of time: woodwork, quilting, weaving, sewing. They wanted me to speak. Me. I stared at the letter for a long time, unsure if it was a mistake. Me? The same woman who once lay on a bathroom floor, wondering if anyone would notice she was gone? But the words were there, in black ink. They'd even called my sewing class a beacon of community healing. Lucille nearly burst with pride when I told her, "Darlin', you're not just living again," she said. "You're blooming." The day of the conference, I wore a blue dress I'd mended myself and pinned Jessica's old handkerchief inside the collar. My fingers trembled as I stepped onto the modest stage, but when I looked out at the small crowd, students, grandmothers, church friends, Annie and her parents, I felt steady. I didn't read from a script. I spoke from the stitches, about how sewing had given me purpose again, how hands that once held a child's fevered forehead could still hold a needle, how being forgotten didn't mean you disappeared. Afterward, people lined up to thank me. A woman pressed my hand and said, "You reminded me that healing is quiet but powerful." A young man whispered, "My mom died last year. This made me feel like I found a piece of her again." I was overwhelmed, grateful, whole. What I didn't know was that one of the attendees, a college intern with a passion for human interest stories, had filmed my speech and uploaded it to a storytelling page on Facebook. It went viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, hundreds of comments. Grandma Stitch was suddenly a name people knew, not because I'd done anything grand, but because I had kept going. And that's when Jessica saw it. She was scrolling late one night, tired, numb, half listening to the hum of Eli's monitor, when the video auto-played. A familiar voice, a familiar laugh, a name she hadn't heard in almost a year. She sat up straight, heart racing. The caption read, "She was thrown away by her family. So she built a new one with a needle and thread." She watched the whole video, twice. Mark walked into the room just as she hit replay. "What are you watching?" Jessica didn't answer right away. Then she said, without looking up, "Did you know my mother's famous now?" Mark blinked. "What?" She turned the screen toward him. "Look." He stared at the video, face unreadable. Jessica watched him closely. "Did you know about this?" Mark shrugged. "No, why would I?" Jessica paused the video. "Because the article said she started the sewing class almost 6 months ago." "So?" "That's when she moved out." Mark's eyes narrowed. "And?" Jessica's voice dropped. "And you told me she didn't want to see us, that she'd moved on." "She did," he said flatly. Jessica stood. "You told me not to reach out, that she needed space, that we were giving her what she wanted." Mark didn't respond. Jessica stared down at the frozen image of her mother on the screen, smiling, radiant, surrounded by students and stitches. She had never looked so alive, and Jessica had missed all of it. She swallowed hard and whispered, "What have we done?" It was a Thursday, the kind with soft sunlight that made even cracked pavement look golden. I arrived early at St. Anne's, as usual, set out the fabric bundles, laid fresh thread in mason jars, and placed little name tags at each chair, something Annie had suggested to make new students feel extra welcome. The room slowly filled with familiar faces, women chatting, laughing, Annie bouncing in with a half-sewn pillowcase, eager for praise. Lucille settling into her chair with her usual dramatic sigh. "These knees were made in 1942, honey. Be kind." I was halfway through demonstrating a French knot when I felt it, a presence at the door. I turned just slightly and saw her. Jessica. She stood just outside the archway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Her hair was longer now, straighter, her clothes neater, more polished. She looked like a woman who had everything under control, but her eyes betrayed her. They were wide, flickering, searching. I held her gaze for a second, then looked away. I didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't cry, just returned to my stitching. She stayed for the whole class, never stepped inside. She watched from a distance, her back straight, her hands occasionally twisting the strap of her purse. A few of the women noticed, whispered among themselves, but no one said anything aloud. When class ended and people began filing out, I looked toward the doorway again. She was gone. I packed slowly that day. The memory of her silhouette lingered in the air like perfume, but I didn't chase it. The next morning, I received a letter, typed, businesslike, polite. It was from Mark. He requested a meeting. "For the sake of resolution and mutual respect," he wrote, "to clear the air and correct past misunderstandings." I almost tossed it in the trash, but something stopped me. Not curiosity, not hope, control. I would choose how this story unfolded. We met at a small cafe near City Hall, public enough for civility, private enough for truth. Mark arrived first, of course, always early, always prepared. He stood as I approached, offered a handshake I didn't accept. We sat. He smiled, tight and practiced. "You look well, Evelyn." "I am well." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he leaned forward. "I think we both agree things got complicated." I raised an eyebrow. "Complicated?" He nodded, still smiling. Emotions ran high. Jessica felt overwhelmed. "You were adjusting. Boundaries got blurred. But I think we can all agree that the past should stay in the past." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "There's one matter, however, that still requires resolution." He slid a folder across the table. "The property issue, the transfer form. I understand there were misunderstandings." "Forgery," I corrected. His smile didn't falter. "Legal terminology aside, we'd like to move forward. If you could sign this document here," he tapped the final page, "we can nullify the complaint and release all parties from further obligation." I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye. "Did she ask you to come?" A flicker, just for a second. "No," he lied. I leaned back, folding my hands. "I saw her yesterday." Mark paused. "I saw her watching my class," I said. "She stood there the whole time, didn't say a word, but I saw her." Still, he said nothing. I smiled then, a small, quiet smile. Not out of amusement, but power. "You think I need this house back to win?" I said. Mark blinked. "I don't," I continued, "because I already won." He frowned. "I don't follow." I gestured to the folder. "This paper doesn't scare me. You don't scare me. And Jessica? I've already grieved her." His jaw clenched. "I used to think silence was punishment," I said, "but now I know it's protection." Mark pushed the folder slightly closer. "Evelyn, be reasonable. This helps everyone. We can move on." I stood. "I have," I said simply. And then, as I picked up my bag and turned to leave, I added one final sentence over my shoulder. "I used to be afraid of both of you, but not anymore." The paper trail was clean, too clean. Mark had forged my signature, yes, but he had been smart about it, documenting the transfer, filing it under Jessica's name, and wrapping the entire thing in layers of legal gray. It would have taken months, maybe years, of court hearings and money I didn't have to win anything back. And even then, I'd be fighting a war that felt old. But I wasn't alone anymore. A woman in my sewing circle, a retired paralegal named Beth, suggested I visit the community legal clinic downtown. They do pro bono work, she said, and if they won't help, I'll dust off my own law books. I smiled, unsure. But something in her tone, a gentle insistence, nudged me forward. At the clinic, I met with a young lawyer named Darnell. He was maybe 28, with a firm handshake and a voice that didn't try to make me feel stupid. I told him everything, from the house to the hospital, from the forged signature to the cafe meeting with Mark. He listened without interrupting, then leaned back and said, "We don't need a courtroom. What we need is clarity." He helped me file a petition to nullify transfer of property due to lack of informed consent and fraudulent representation. It sounded complicated, but in plain English, I didn't give them my permission, and I had proof. Within 6 weeks, the transfer was reversed. No dramatic hearings, no headlines, just a quiet piece of paper mailed to my apartment confirming what I already knew deep in my bones. It was never theirs to take. Lucille cried when I told her. "Let's celebrate," she said. "Champagne and sewing needles." Even Beth baked me a cake shaped like a house, lopsided but sweet. But when they asked the obvious next question, "Are you moving back in?" I shook my head. "No," I said simply. "That house is a chapter, not my home." They didn't argue. The apartment, small and cracked as it was, held more of me now than any room in that old house ever did. Here, I'd survived. Here, I'd chosen to keep living. Here, I'd rebuilt, not just walls, but self. 1 week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Inside, a folded letter, handwritten. Not a card, not an apology. Just paper, ink, and the voice of a daughter I once knew. "Mom, I saw your interview. I watched the video. I heard your voice echo through my living room like it belonged there again. For a moment, I thought about calling, but I didn't know what to say. You once told me to be strong, to stand tall, to never let anyone decide for me who I was." I listened. I followed that advice all the way into a life that pushed you out. Mark didn't force me. I chose him. I chose that version of stability because it made sense, because it was easier than sitting in the complexity of what we were becoming. You were right to walk away. I see that now, but I won't ask you to come back. I don't deserve that. You raised me to be sharp, and I used those edges against you. You raised me to think for myself, and I thought my way into silence. You raised me too well, so I became like Mark. Not because he made me, because I didn't know how else to be. I hope you're happy. You look radiant in those pictures. I don't expect a reply. I just wanted you to know I haven't forgotten, no signature. But she didn't need to. I sat at the table for a long time, the letter open beside my tea, the edges fluttering under the fan's low breeze. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something far more powerful. Release. Jessica had finally said something real, and while it wasn't the reconciliation I once prayed for, it was honest. That mattered. Because sometimes the most meaningful form of recognition isn't applause. It's acknowledgement. Not public, not grand, just truth. And that night, I added one more entry to the old journal I'd kept all those years ago, the one with crooked childhood handwriting and ink-stained pages. Today, I wrote, I remembered who I am, and someone else did too. It was a Tuesday. Most quiet revelations in my life had a way of finding me on Tuesdays. Maybe it was the rhythm of routine, or maybe the world simply settled a little differently that day of the week. The sewing circle had just finished its session. Threads tangled, laughter echoed, chairs screeched against the tile floors. Annie had stayed behind, as she often did, helping gather the scattered pincushions and tidying up the chalkboard where I wrote the day's lesson. Even broken threads still hold things together. She was unusually quiet, fingers twitching as if they held words she hadn't stitched into sentences yet. When the room was empty and sunlight streamed through the stained glass window in long, golden strokes, she finally said, "Grandma Stitch, I have something for you." From behind her back, she pulled a small box. It was wrapped in brown paper tied with soft blue yarn, hand-spun, uneven, imperfect, just like life. My hands hesitated. "What is it?" "It's from someone," she said, voice lowered, "who didn't know how else to send it." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a single folded card, ivory paper, handwritten. The scent of lilac clung to the page. My throat tightened before I even read a word. "Mom, I know I said I didn't expect a reply. I still don't. But I thought maybe you'd allow this one more whisper into your life. I won't come. I'm not ready. Not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid of what I'll see in your eyes. I'm afraid of the reflection of the person I've become. But I want you to know, you were the center of my universe once. And though I moved away from that orbit, I still feel the pull. I still feel you. I hope you're warm. I hope you're proud of the woman you've become, not just the mother you were. I hope you laugh often. I hope your hands never stop making beautiful things. I'm sorry I lost sight of you, but you were never invisible to me. Not really. But love always, Jessica. There was no pretense, no apology wrapped in excuses, just truth. I closed the card, placed it gently back inside the box, and sat in silence. For a moment, I simply breathed. Let the sunlight touch my face. Let the dust float unbothered in the air around me. Let the decades of wounds and words settle into something softer. Then I walked home. That evening, I pulled out a piece of linen I'd been saving. The softest one, aged to a creamy hue, sturdy but gentle. I threaded a needle, found my quiet chair near the window, and began to sew. The sun was setting, casting a golden-orange glow across my lap. Each stitch felt like a beat in a song only I knew, measured, intentional, forgiving. I didn't stitch Jessica's name. I didn't stitch mine. I stitched a single small phrase. I am still here. That was enough. No applause, no stage, no audience. Just the hum of the thread, the creak of the rocking chair, and the calm that comes not from being celebrated, but from surviving, from continuing, from refusing to disappear. I didn't know if Jessica would ever show up. I didn't know if Eli would remember me. I didn't know if Mark would ever feel remorse, or if forgiveness would ever find a place in the folds of our history. But I knew this. My worth wasn't waiting in their hands. It had always lived in mine. Later, as the room dimmed and stars began to blink in the dusk, I folded the linen and placed it gently beside the card. Not in a box, not hidden, on the shelf, where it belonged. A reminder that the greatest triumph wasn't reclaiming a house, or winning in court, or going viral on the internet. It was this, sitting here, threading one needle at a time, maying one line at a time,